why does Ukraine keep fighting? Why does Ukraine not just make peace? Why is there not a ceasefire yet? And what motivates the Ukrainians on the front to keep fighting? These are very important questions, very good questions, with equally important answers. But in order to understand the answers, you're gonna have to go through a lot of information. It's not terribly complicated, but it's a lot, and that's why I hope to cover today. Because the answers are simple, but not straightforward. So hello YouTube, I'm Michael Size, and the Western public, or at least many among the Western public, seem to believe that a freezing of the conflict is possible. People assume that somewhere in the set of all possible actions that the Ukrainian government could take, there is one or more of them that would lead to a freezing of the conflict, where Ukraine just makes some token concessions and the fighting simply stops along the current lines of control, kind of like how the Minsk II Accord worked back in 2015. And what I find is that people assume that the reason why Ukraine isn't taking these imaginary options is just because they want to recover the territories and they don't care how much fighting it takes to do so. But the fact is that such an option, a freezing of the conflict, is simply not an option that exists for Ukraine. So what are Ukraine's options? I'll give you the short and long versions. The short version is that Russia's conditions for a ceasefire are for Ukraine to completely surrender. Russia will not accept anything less than Ukraine's complete surrender. And Russia has said this repeatedly. They've said it to Ukraine, to France, to Germany, to the UK, to Turkey, to the US, and now they've said it to the US again when Trump wanted to hear it said to his face. Well, they said it to his face. And all of these countries attempted to negotiate or moderate a freezing of the conflict, with the fighting just being stopped along the current lines of control and making a new temporary de facto border, but Russia told every single one of them the same thing over and over. Russia will not make concessions, and it will not stop for anything less than Ukraine's complete surrender. And that's the short version. Now for the long version, Russia has a list of demands for a ceasefire. So the deal they propose doesn't just say declaration of surrender in the title, but it undeniably amounts to a declaration of surrender. And while the exact demands have varied a little bit over time, there are a few constants, and these are the parts that actually matter. Number 1, Russia wants control of the entire territory of the 5 regions that it claims to have annexed. As a reminder, these are Crimea, which was annexed in 2014, Donetsk, Lugansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia, which were annexed in 2022, and of these, Donetsk and Lugansk are the regions that make up the Donbass area that you might have heard about. And the current line of control runs approximately along the middle of this territory, with the biggest population centers being under Ukrainian control. So even just from the point of view of territory and economic value, this is already a huge demand for Russia to make. But believe it or not, the territory and populations are not actually the deal breaker for this request, but rather the deal breaker is the fact that this would put all of the existing fortifications, including the natural barriers, on the Russian side of the border, while leaving Ukraine with a completely unfortified border running along a steppe. Now remember that the only way in which a ceasefire can ever lead to a lasting peace is if it leaves both sides with an equally strong deterrent against a restart of the hostilities. And a peace deal that puts several layers of fortifications in Russian territory and 0 in Ukrainian territory doesn't deter anything, it just invites renewed Russian hostilities in the future. But this is just the tip of the iceberg, because Russia's second demand is for Ukraine to dismantle its army, or rather to limit the size of its army, both manpower and equipment, to certain very low numbers dictated by Russia, and to limit the quality of said equipment to certain very low parameters also dictated by Russia. Once again, we have the same deterrence problem, and a deal like this does nothing about securing long-term peace. All it does is facilitate further Russian aggression. Now, some viewers may argue that other countries have chosen demilitarization in the past, and it's fine if you have a large superpower as a protector. Well, fear not, because Russia has your argument covered as well, with their third demand, which is that Ukraine be banned from joining international alliances and any any foreign intervention in Ukraine must only be allowed to happen if Russia gives its approval of it, which is just the cherry on top. So to sum it all up, Russia's conditions for a ceasefire are that Ukraine become unarmed, unfortified and unprotected, while Russia has free rein to rebuild its military and stage it all around Ukraine. And the thing with this is that even in a hypothetical scenario where the deal could be expanded to rein Russia's army in as well, it still wouldn't work, because this was tried before with the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, where Ukraine drastically reduced the size of its army in exchange for Russian guarantees of non-aggression, and what we see is that Ukraine has kept up its side of the bargain while Russia hasn't. Then in 1997, Russia once again signed off on the inviolability of the Russo-Ukrainian border, and again in 2003, and it broke all of these agreements. The same occurred with the Minsk II agreement, which required Russia to, quote, restore control of the state border to the Ukrainian government in the whole conflict zone, end quote, which Russia never did, and thus the agreement was never fully implemented. So whatever agreement Russia does propose, even if it seems like it includes concessions in theory, in reality we can be certain that Russia will not abide by any restrictions in any of the treaties that it signs, meaning that as long as the proposal still involves Ukraine making itself defenseless, it is not a serious proposal because it amounts to no less than complete surrender. And this is why Trump's 24-hour peace plan failed. He tried the same thing as a dozen world leaders before him, namely asking Russia and Ukraine to both make concessions, and he got the same result as a dozen world leaders before him, namely Russia telling him that it will not make any concessions. Very predictable. So Ukraine can either keep fighting and try to win the war, or it can surrender. So I guess the next question would be, why doesn't Ukraine surrender? Why does Ukraine choose to not surrender? It's a bit of a weird question, right? I mean, I haven't really heard of countries that intend to not defend themselves in case of an invasion, with the exception of perhaps Hungary, so not surrendering kind of is the default option. So we have to flip the question and ask, why would you even consider surrendering? And the most common argument in favor of surrender seems to be that defending is deemed by some people to be a waste of life. But I don't think that that argument applies here. I think the waste of life argument holds a lot of weight in asymmetric conflicts where, for example, you're using infantry and cavalry to defend against an enemy that has artillery and armored vehicles. And you can definitely see how in this kind of confrontation, the defense could be deemed as a waste of life. But what Ukraine is fighting is a peer conflict, with Ukrainians sitting in their fortifications, firing at Russian infantry and combat ladas as they charge across the battlefield. If anything, the situation is actually flipped, as the rate of casualties favors Ukraine both as an absolute value as well as a percentage of the population. So if anything, the waste of life argument is best applied to the Russian side. Now the second most common argument is probably along the lines of, why does it even matter though? As in, why should you spend any lives defending at all when you can just live under Moscow rule the same way that you lived under Kiev rule previously? Isn't it basically the same thing? Does it really change anything for everyday people? And in this particular case, the answer is that it is not the same thing, and it does change a lot for everyday people, and we can know this because the occupied territories provide a precedent, a template, a blueprint for what is going to happen to the citizens of all of Ukraine under Russian occupation. And what it shows is pretty terrible. For example, landowners are going to have their land stolen. We've been hearing about expropriations like this since 2014 in both Crimea and the Donbass, and in 2022 we got perhaps the most egregious open example of one Russian company receiving 160,000 hectares of stolen farmland. And prior to this particular disclosure, I think a lot of people, including myself, were in disbelief at the stories coming out of Crimea and the occupied occupied Donbass, but now that we have this sort of confirmation that this is normal practice in the occupied territories, it also gives credibility to similar stories of not only farmland, but also small and medium enterprises being seized. But it also gets worse than expropriations, because a lot of former landowners and business owners fled these occupied territories after seeing their peers get disappeared. And this was another accusation that many of us found difficult to believe, but the systematic presence of mass graves of civilians and of torture chambers documented in liberated territories grant credibility to the accusations of disappearances like this being a common practice in occupied territories. But of course it does get even worse, because the worst part is that the civilians in the occupied territories were mobilized to fight against the rest of Ukraine. If you look at pretty much any assessment of Russian manpower and losses early in the war, you will find that the people of the Donbass were the first cannon fodder. They had been mobilized as cannon fodder, and they made up a significant percentage of the initial casualties. So it's pretty bad. I mean, the citizens of Russia itself already don't have that many rights, and they definitely have fewer rights than what Ukrainians hope to achieve by winning the war. And so even if Ukraine could be integrated as a regular part of Russia, it would still be a downgrade. But everything that we've seen so far shows that occupied Ukrainian territories are not being integrated as a regular part of Russia. They have fewer rights still, fewer democratic rights, fewer human rights, fewer property rights, and they become fair game for cannon fodder mobilization. And I think it's that last part that really seals the deal against this argument, because it's not about a trade-off, it's about a direct downgrade. So like, it's not, yeah, you'll be a slave, but at least you won't have war. It's actually, you'll be a slave in the new war invading Poland and Romania. So Ukrainians can either fight now with dignity, fighting for their own country, or if they surrender, they can fight as cannon fodder for an occupier against their former allies. Exactly the same position that the people of the Donbass have been put in after 2014. And this leads us nicely into the last point that I want to cover, which is what motivates the soldiers at the front to keep fighting. And the answer is everything that I've explained so far. Everything that the average Westerner doesn't understand, and which I've explained here, all of this the Ukrainians know and understand, and they know and understand it better, more deeply, and on a more personal level than I do. Because I've said in the beginning that none of this is complicated, it's just extensive. And this means that you don't have to be any kind of international geopolitical analyst to have a comprehensive and up-to-date view of the situation. You just have to put in the time to study it, and the Ukrainian public and soldiers have done their homework. While the Western public may be confused as to why there isn't a peace yet, because they haven't bothered to study and understand any of the options that Ukraine actually has, the Ukrainian public and the Ukrainian fighters have studied and understood everything, and as a result, they know what they're fighting for. I think it's a classic example of how bad times make strong men, and it's a terrible situation that the Ukrainians have been forced into, through no fault of their own. They didn't go to war, the war came to them. So when it comes to ending the war, nobody wants to end the war as much as Ukraine wants to do it, but as of right now, it simply isn't an option for them. So what's the alternative? Well, I do believe that Ukraine does have an endgame in mind, a plan for victory. I don't think they're just doing open-ended fighting. I don't think they're just stalling a stalemate. And I think I understand the kind of victory that they're going for, but this is a story for another time. Until then, thank you for watching, like and subscribe.